I just got a shipment of fabric in the mail. But before I can sew with it, I have to prepare my fabric for cutting and sewing. And I figured now was as good a time as any to talk about how and why we pre-treat our fabric before we sew. So think of it this way. All the measurements in the world, no matter how accurate the measurements are, no matter how much time I spend choosing the pattern size or how careful I am when I cut, none of that will matter if I use fabric that when I launder it shrinks in the laundry. Because the garment that I spent all this time and effort and care getting to be the perfect size is going to go through the wash one time and it will no longer fit my body, right? Instead, we prepare our fabric ahead of time and we shrink the yardage so that when we use our body measurements, when we get the perfect pattern size, when we cut carefully, when we sew carefully, the finished garment comes out and fits exactly the way we want it to fit. All that requires is a little bit of prep work from us ahead of time. Now, two things. One, the type of fabric that you have will decide what type of prep work you need to do. For example, this fabric is a non-stretch woven cotton. And like most of the things that are in my wardrobe, it will go through the washing machine and the tumble dryer because that is the life that I want to live. But not every fabric that I adore can go through the washer dryer like a cotton can, for example. Now this is a 100% wool designer dead stock, but because it's 100% wool, it can't go through the tumble dryer. Wool is like off the charts sustainable. It will keep you warm even when it's wet. It is strong when it's wet, but it shrinks. It shrinks like crazy shrinks. You cannot run it through the washer dryer and have it come out the same size. And all of us have lost a sweater. All of us have lost a sweater that way. So that does not mean that you take your wool yardage and you just sew with it willy-nilly. You do still have to pre-shrink it ahead of time. So we're gonna do both. All right, so we're gonna treat these two different cuts of fabric differently, right? The cotton is going to be pre-washed and the wool is going to be pre-shrunk. Anytime I pre-wash fabric, the first thing I do is finish off the raw edges. So when your cut yardage comes, you'll be able to see the selvage, which is the machined edge where it comes off the loom, just like, you know, like olden times. You'll see on the selvage, a lot of times you can actually see the machined holes where it rolled through the tumblers in the manufacturing process. But then you'll also have the raw edge. The raw edge is the edge where the fabric was cut off the yardage on the bolt. So whenever you went to purchase it, there is a cut edge. This cut edge on a woven fabric will absolutely unravel. On a knit fabric, it will not. You don't have to do this next step when you are working with a knit fabric because by definition, a knit fabric will not unravel at the place where it is cut. But knit fabrics like a t-shirt fabric or a lounge pants or something like that, they generally shrink twice. Not just the first time you launder them, but also the second time. So this next step where we're going to treat the raw edge so it doesn't unravel in the laundry, you can skip if you're working with knit fabric, but you're going to double the next step where we run it through the washing machine. The simplest and most efficient way to finish off these raw edges before we sew is to overcast with a zigzag stitch. So I'm using my standard presser foot, I'm on a zigzag, and I'm going to sew on the fabric, off the fabric, on the fabric, off the fabric, on the fabric, off the fabric, all the way down. And the threads will wrap around this raw edge and secure all of those loose stitches. So a couple things about this. One, the wider your zigzag, the better. Because the wider the zigzag, the more of the fabric you'll actually catch. And then the second is, this is a great place to use up like old bobbins, you know, where the bobbin isn't completely filled. Put the bobbin on top of your machine and use up just random little chunks of thread because it does not matter what color this thread is, right? It can be any old laying around bobbin that needs to be emptied. Instead of throwing that in the garbage, use it to overcast these edges. So if you're watching, the center of my presser foot here is lined up with this raw edge as much as possible, and it's going on, off, on, off the fabric to capture all those edges. So this is a great place to start thinking about, like, I don't know, like what can we practice while we're doing this? You can zone out. You can practice your skills at sewing in a straight line, because we're maintaining this edge. So maybe you're pretty new to sewing and this is like one of your first garments. Here's a great place to practice sewing in a straight line. Maybe you are a timid driver at the sewing machine. You know, like you don't like going super fast. Here's a chance to practice sewing a little faster than you normally do. There are lots of ways that we can make this meditative act of preparation rather than a chore. When you get to the other end, just take it off. There's no reason to backstitch because these are only functional in that they are securing the raw edge so it won't unravel. Some of this seems time consuming, right? All of this is prep work. This is the exposition of the mystery novel where you have to meet all the characters so you know who the suspects are going to be. And it can be very tempting to skip all this. I get that. There are a lot of parts to sewing before you get to the sewing. And it is absurdly tempting to skip all those steps. I get it. If I could skip straight to the part where I'm actually making the garment, I'm not sure I would ever stop sewing. It is this powerful act of creation. And if you skip the prep work, it doesn't matter how good your sewing is. Your results will never be as good as they could be, right? So I like to think of the prep work differently. I like to think of the prep work as something with its own appeal. I tend to break my sewing up into chunks, chapters. One of the chapters is the construction, right? And for a lot of us, me included, when I think of sewing, I think of the construction stage, the chapter that comes after construction, which is finishing, like hems and buttonholes and things. I'm very prone to skipping that chapter. If I was going to ever skip a chapter, that I would be skipping finishing. There are chapters that we all want to skip, okay? But when you back it up, so we've got finishing, that's like hems and buttons and buttonholes. The actual sewing, this construction part, there's the cutting part, pattern preparation, and at the very beginning, fabric preparation. And so I treat those like separate chapters, separate like train stations on the journey toward a garment, right? It's very easy to be irritated. I could think back and remember like what a hardship those steps all felt like, but they don't feel like that anymore. They really feel like now I get to prepare my fabric. Now I get to prepare my pattern. I try to look at each step as being funner than I used to think of it. So here's how I treat fabric preparation. When I get new fabric, before I prepare my pattern, before I cut anything out, I get to handle it and touch it and kind of get to know it, like do a lap before we commit to making the garment that we had planned. And that has begun to feel wise to me. It has begun to feel like, oh, I'm getting a better sense of how does it drape? How does it move? How does it handle? Is it going to be tricky? Do I need more pins? Do I need stabilizer? What kind of interfacing do I want to use? I can start asking questions, anticipating problems while I'm handling the yardage because I'm touching the fabric a little bit more. For me, because I treat this step as its own discrete step, I actually do have a stack of fabric that has all been pre-shrunk. It's all ready to go. It is washed and dried and folded up lovingly and put in a beautiful stack where I can touch it whenever I want. And when the moment arrives for me to use it, I don't have to do this step because I already did this step way ahead of time. I start by taking all of that prepared yardage straight to my washing machine. The edges are overcast, so it won't unravel. I toss in the piece I'm doing, and in this load, I'm also going to do some khaki corduroy and some white corduroy. But Deborah, wait, the colors will bleed. No, they won't. I love these Shout color catcher sheets. I throw them in every load.
When I launder everything, I want to get off any chemicals from the manufacturing. So I put in detergent and I set it to the bulky or the bedding setting and then let it run. When I put it in the dryer, I use these felted wool dryer balls. They help to prevent static, but also keep everything from sticking together. When the fabric comes out of the machine, because it's yardage, I shake it all out. I don't want any knots. I don't want it all like wrapped around each other. I shake each piece out separately, and you'll notice the white is still perfectly white because look, the color catcher sheets work every single time. I throw it in the dryer, and again, I set it on the bulky or the bedding setting, like the comforter setting on some machines. And I like to put it on more dry if that's an option. And then I let the cycle run. I go take a shower, get dressed, whatever. And when I get it out, I shake everything out again. Sometimes it comes out and it's in like a big ball and you have to shake it out. If it's still damp, I run it through one more time. But then once everything comes out, I fold it up neatly into almost like little packets. Like I fold it in half and I fold it in half again, and then I fold it lengthwise, kind of like a towel. These are 3 and 4 yard cuts, so they're fairly large, but the benefit of folding them all consistently as if this is, for the linen closet, is that when I go back later, like if I don't sew with it right away, I can see those overcast edges. I can see that it's folded into this sort of little packet, and I know immediately this fabric has already been prepared to sew. It needs pressing, but it's ready to work with right now, and I don't have to wait before I can cut into it.
But what about our wool? With wool fabric, you do not need to finish off the raw edge. It also has a selvage and it has a cut edge, just like our cotton did. However, because we aren't going to run it through a washer and a tumble dryer, we don't need to finish the raw edge off. You can if you like the effect of it, or if you have a wool, and this one's kind of showing you that, where the window pane is coming a little bit undone, you can tidy that up a little bit by overcasting the edges just like we did with our cotton, but you're not obligated to. The difference is when we pre-shrink our wool yardage, we're going to do that at the iron rather than in the tumble dryer.
Now, remember, we're not going to launder our wool. We're not going to run it through the washer for sure, because wool fibers will mat together and felt if you run them through the washer. And I have read, it's pretty popular right now actually, to recommend that you take your wool yardage and a damp cloth and throw it in the dryer and run it through the dryer. And I don't subscribe to that method either. I would actually prefer to take my wool yardage to my dry cleaner first. I'd be more likely to do that. So generally, the rule of thumb is whatever you're going to do to the garment, do to the yardage. In this case, I'm steaming it. You can see like there's kind of some downtime when you want to use steam to pre-shrink your wool fabric. The goal is to shoot the steam through it and draw up the fibers and get them to shrink a little bit ahead of time. But before I can move the moist fabric, I want to make sure that all the steam has been pushed through. A dry cleaner actually has a steam bed, which is like a steam iron like I'm using. I'm injecting steam into the fabric because my ironing board, this you can see now, it's a standard ironing board. Because it has holes underneath it, the steam will shoot through the ironing board and out the other side. A dry cleaner will have a steam table that actually has a suction component to it, so it shoots steam into it and then sucks it out the other side, so there's less wait time for them. You don't necessarily have to have chemicals if you take it to the dry cleaner. You can actually have them use their steam suction press board to do it, or you can do it yourself for free at your house. You can see here that I am not ironing, I am pressing. I lift the iron and lay it on top of a section of the fabric that hasn't been ironed yet, and I inject steam into it. And then I allow it to cool and dry completely before I move it. The other option is to use a press cloth. Now, you might have an iron, and a lot of home irons are like this. They're not very powerful. They make steam, but the steam option isn't super powerful. I've taken a piece of unbleached muslin, which is just like very close to a quilt weight cotton. I have saturated it so much, you saw me rubbing my hands there. I've saturated it so much that it is actually damp. And now I lay it on top of the wrong side of my wool yardage and I press. You can see a little bit better here that as I press, I'm not ironing. I am placing the iron on the fabric and holding it, and then I lift and move it to the next section. The goal with the press cloth is to introduce some moisture, because that's what causes these wool fibers to draw up to one another and pre-shrink so that it won't shrink later in the finished garment. So it's important that I lift, press, wait, lift, press, wait. And then after I finish, I'm going to take the press cloth off, just like I did before when I was only using the iron, and allow the fabric to cool and dry completely before I move to a new section. So if you have a standard home ironing board, the kind that squeaks and folds up, you should have enough length on that ironing board to lay out selvage to selvage your fabric. And then most of them are a standard 12 or 15 inches wide. So you can do a chunk that's width of fabric by 12 or 15 inches at a time, and then leave it and either walk away and go do other things and come back and then do the next section, or hang out and dance and sing a song and read a book and, talk to your friends and answer your email or look at Instagram while you wait for that section, that unit of the fabric to be ready for you to move on to the next one. It is super important to make sure you get all the moisture out so you don't distort or stretch the fibers before you move on.
And there you have it. That is preparing your fabric for sewing, either by pre-washing or by pre-shrinking. Either way, you want to make sure that the yardage you're using to cut your garment before you sew has already been prepared for sewing. Have fun, you guys.